we have the chance to welcome Professor Schenk with us today, and we are doing this brief interview before the lecture that she'll be giving at 5 o'clock. I'm Elsa Massoc, a Max Weber Fellow, and this is Andrea Papadia, another Max Weber Fellow. So, Andrea, if you want to start with the questions.
So I'll start with the first question. So the first question is, why did you choose to be a historian in order to understand contemporary capitalism?
Right. Gosh, does one decide to be a historian, or does it just kind of happen to you? I don't know. I began by studying international relations, and I became a bit frustrated with political science, and so I became much more interested in the economics part. And when I studied economics a long time ago, there were 2 required courses in addition to your micro econometrics, and one was economic history and one was history of economic thought. And I was really taken by the economic history, the ability to apply the ideas and the graphs and the technicalities of what I was learning in my economics to the real world in this sort of historical context. And indeed it was the Great Depression, studying the Great Depression, which everybody still studies, that really inspired me to think about the debates about and the controversies about how economies work and how government policy works. That kind of brought my economics to life.
Very much.
So, with your historical work, you argue that public actors have made use of the past to tackle the most immediate effect of the financial crisis. And now, 10 years after the financial crisis, we've entered kind of a second phase, the return to the normal. And my question to you is, we are still yet to return to the normal, and my question to you is, do the actors use the past in the same way as they've used the past right after the crisis? If they don't, why?
I think my sort of the generation of my interest in this particular issue about how the past is used really came out of the onset of the global financial crisis, and the fact that Ben Bernanke, the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, is an economic historian, and he's an economic historian of the Great Depression. And I think his work really influenced how he thought about the global financial crisis and how to respond. And I think it also affected how others did. So the immediate responses to the global financial crisis, I think, were directly related to our understanding, our historical understanding of what made the 1930s Great Depression so great and so depressed, which had to do with allowing monetary contraction during that era. So I think it had a direct impact and was used directly in terms of monetary expansion, and in the short term, the fiscal expansion, although that didn't last quite as long. And I think everybody got very excited about economic history after that, and it was marvelous, and everybody wanted to hear about economic history. And they still do, which I find inspiring. But I think the pressure of a crisis moment, when you're sitting there in the dark room or in the boardroom, trying to come up with an answer to an event that you haven't expected to have happen, you have, I think these policymakers and public actors or bankers or whomever do have a sense of some kind of idea of what happens in crises, and a sense of some kind of past episodes that they do turn to in times of crisis, and something unanticipated where they haven't got a plan for what to do next. It's natural to look to the past, and I think that is indeed what happened, and the evidence of my research suggests that that is what happened. Now 10 years on, I think you're right. I think the past is used differently when you're not in an absolute crisis situation. Nevertheless, I've been quite inspired by the way that international institutions like the International Monetary Fund or the Bank for International Settlements is interested in how the solutions that are being discussed now for reforming the international monetary system, reforming the international financial architecture, echo with some of the solutions for other times of great instability in the global economy, such as the 1970s or even the 1980s. So there's a continuing interest. I don't think it's as intense, and it may not be as immediately effective, but I think there is a continuing interest in the past that way.
So, interestingly, when there is a high constraint in time, because you have to react to the crisis very quickly, like people would remember the past more accurately than when they have more time.
I wonder if they remember how people were blamed and are worried about making the same mistake. So I think they're looking maybe for mistakes of the past rather than even in positive outcomes, possibly.
So continuing with this parallel with the Great Depression, which keeps coming up, I don't mind personally. So we've seen in recent years that the liberal order has kind of come under severe stress, like it did in the interwar period. However, as you mentioned, there was very different reactions to the Great Depression compared to the recent crisis, at least partially because people learned from the past. So why do you think that we've still had this kind of strain on the liberal order in the case of this crisis as well?
I think one thing that wasn't learned possibly is how to distribute the pain and the outcome of a financial crisis. And I think that sense of unfairness, the way that the weight has fallen on taxpayers or on certain sectors of the population, has generated a sense of alienation that has led to movements of populism and indeed of economic nationalism. And maybe this is a lesson that wasn't really learned from the 1930s, is that we seem to have got out of the global financial crisis, at least in terms of the recovery of trade and recovery of a lot of some of the real economic variables, and we see the recovery of the American economy at the moment, for example. And so it didn't seem that it seemed that we had kind of avoided those problems that led to economic nationalism. But we are seeing 10 years after, this is a long period in which people have been living through austerity, often in Europe, that kind of patience and that alienation and the increasing inequality in societies that seems to be blamed on this financial crisis has had more political consequences that encourage a retreat from that globalization. I think on top of that, of course, we've had the refugee crisis and the issues of migration. So conflict elsewhere in the world has generated challenges, particularly for Europe, but also for elsewhere. And I'm not going to say they're unrelated to the collapse of the global system. They are, but in more complicated ways. And this again has challenged national borders and national identities in ways that is very damaging at a time when people feel quite alienated or socially alienated.
Yeah, thank you very much.
So to follow up on these questions and the back and forth between economics and politics, so the next step, a little bit of the question is that do you think that the political polarization that we see in Europe and advanced political economies nowadays make it more difficult to reform the financial sector? For instance, in making these issues less politically salient compared to, for instance, the crisis of immigration, of migration.
I think there still is a will to try to ensure that the kind of excesses and the sort of contagion, if you like, or the cross-border spread of financial crisis doesn't happen again. And I think there have been a lot of reforms in regulation and supervision, both macroprudential supervision as well as microprudential supervision. And certainly that was quite innovative over the past 10 years. There's some signs, however, that kind of momentum of that may slow down as people become more complacent and interest groups and others are able to kind of capture those regulations a little bit more. So I think there's a sense in which I think people are wanting to retreat from globalization in terms of movement of people and maybe even trade in some contexts. But the desire to try to avoid a global financial crisis is still there.
That's good news.
A bit contradictory. So the retreat from globalization, I suppose, I feel really started with that antipathy to migration.
Right.
And that was founded, I think, in political as well as economic, and how people conceived their position after the global financial crisis and who bore the brunt of that. And a lot of the rhetoric around inequalities and this sort of thing. And that seemed to be the beginning of that retreat that then has moved on.
So moving away, I guess, from the Great Depression and the crisis, maybe we want to talk a little bit more about, you as a scholar and, particularly what are the practical challenges that you've encountered, in your research, in your career, in the history of, studying the history of international monetary system?
Practical challenges. Well, I'm a really archive-based researcher, so I love getting into the papers and seeing everybody's marginalia and doing all the kind of fun stuff, which sounds boring to some people, but getting some sense of that, the physical artifact, I think is really crucial. But of course, you can't get access to everything. So some banks, for example, don't have very accessible archives, and some collections are somewhat incomplete. So that's been a bit frustrating. But history isn't about recreating the past. So you're not trying to kind of use your sources to kind of recreate the past. You're using it to collect evidence for particular kinds of arguments. So it's not insurmountable. Not sure what other kind of challenges I might have faced in my academic research. I guess I do some. I like to breach that line between the academy and historical research and the policy making sphere, and with the public sphere and doing interviews or talking to the public or something like that. And I find that's very challenging for historians because we see a lot of complexity and our arguments are always nuanced and slightly hedged, and they're contingent and this sort of thing, and they're embedded in that kind of framework. Whereas policymakers and indeed the public just have a blunt, is it this or that? And you go, well, on the one hand, on the other hand. And so that can be difficult. And I feel sometimes trying to lead you down a path that's something more certain than you want to be. And you need to be really careful about that, I think, as a historian, that you recognize and respect your own discipline.
Yeah, I understood also that people sometimes would ask you to predict the future as an historian.
Yeah.
I didn't really like that.
I find, well, that's what people are looking for, aren't they? They're looking for some kind of guide to the future. And I say, well, there are resonances with the past. History doesn't repeat itself, is one of my mantras. And the other one is that you're just trying to show them how these issues were dealt with in the past. And they can say, well, we could do the same thing now or not, but you need to understand why they succeeded or failed in the past, and then assess what has changed or what you can do to change that policy to make it more effective in the present day. But that's up to them. No.
So, like a last general question is, what would be the advice that you would give to a young scholar eager to start a career in economic history?
I think it still is a really marvelous time to be doing economic history. I think you need to know your chops in terms of economics, because you need to be able, and also history, you need to be able to speak to kind of a wide audience. It's sort of intrinsically interdisciplinary. And so the ability to share your ideas and have an influence on a wide range of maybe politics, political history, different kinds of histories, economics and economic policy making, make it a kind of an exciting sort of discipline. But there still is a kind of a real interest in applying economic ideas to historical problems as an end in itself, and as something interesting also to influence how economic theory develops, but also how influencing sort of policy making. So my advice would be to go for it.
Great.
Well, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. I'm looking forward to this afternoon's lecture.
Yeah.